Well, everybody, I think we will go ahead and get started because we do have a fascinating, action-packed, and information-filled presentation for you this morning. So again, everybody, welcome to the 2023 Minnesota TZD Traffic Safety Hot Dish for March of 2023, or I should say April of 2023. Today, we're going to explore cannabis and the highway through the lens of EMS, law enforcement, and prosecution. My name is Mike Hansen, and I have the privilege of serving as the director for the Department of Public Safety's Office of Traffic Safety, and I also serve as one of 3 co-chairs for the Minnesota Towards Zero Deaths program. I'd like to give a big shout out to the sponsors that make these webinars possible. First of all, our partners at the Minnesota Department of Health and the Minnesota Department of Transportation, along with the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, who all provide the support and the background that make the webinars possible. I'd also be remiss if I didn't give a big shout out to our partners at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, who provide much of the funding that makes our programs possible. Also, a big shout out to Linda and Stephanie and the crew at the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies for helping us keep us on track, organized, and technologically working. For everybody's information, today's webinar is being recorded and it will be posted. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. PDFs of the PowerPoints will also be made available following the presentations, and professional development hours forms are also available. And the forms can be found on the TZD Traffic Safety Hot Dish webpage, which is shown below. There's a couple of functional buttons at the bottom of the webinar bar. First of all, the chat function is to use to share ideas with all participants that are on the webinar, and let the panelists know if you need technical assistance, and we will do the best that we can to help get you up to speed and back into and joining the webinar. What I'd really like to point out is the Q&A function, which is used to submit any questions that you have for the speakers. I think that the way we will run the show today is we're going to have all 3 of the speakers do their presentation. We will save all the questions for the discussion at the end. So please, if you have questions, and I really encourage you to ask those questions, use the Q&A function. We are going to begin our presentation today with Mr. Dylan Ferguson. Dylan serves as the Executive Director for the Emergency Services Regulatory Board at the Department of Health. And Dylan has been an EMT paramedic for the last 18 years. As the Director of EMSRB, he supports EMS across the state by providing information and data for making improvements to Minnesota's EMS system and providing valuable data and intelligence on matters that intersect public health and public safety. Dylan, I'm really looking forward to your presentation, and the screen is all yours.
Well, good morning, and thank you for that introduction, Director Hansen. As he said, my name's Dylan Ferguson, Executive Director for the EMS Regulatory Board. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning as we kind of, take a look at some emerging trends and seeing how different factors, in this instance, cannabis can play an impact on Minnesota's roadways. So first off, some of you may not be familiar with the Emergency Medical Services Regulatory Board. So I just want to take a kind of a brief minute this morning. So ultimately, the EMSRB is a 17-member board charged with administration and oversight of the state's emergency medical services system. It is a freestanding independent board whose members are appointed by the governor. Our primary focus is to support the system, protect the public health and safety, ultimately through regulation of that system. So here in Minnesota, we have 341 different ambulance service licensees, otherwise referred to as EMS agencies. They operate 804 ground ambulances throughout the state and respond to about 715,000 calls every year. And that includes both our 911 responses and all of our interfacility transfers, moving patients from one facility to another. And the reason why we're here this morning is that one of our major functions relates to data collection. Every single Minnesota licensed ambulance service is required to submit patient care records or patient care reports to the board, and we utilize that data to help improve the system and do it to when we can answer burning questions with near real time kind of results and seeing what's going on out there to help us paint a picture for better situational awareness so that all stakeholders can be on the same page. And it's going to be that data which is kind of serves as the basis for today's presentation. So most of us on the webinar today are familiar that there have been numerous policy discussions in legislatures across the country, and certainly Minnesota is no different, regarding the use of THC, cannabis, and other types of derivatives. Probably one of the most recent changes that we've seen is that in July of 2022, we all saw changes to the state's laws regarding the legality of different concentrations of THC in edibles, along with different pieces of regulation that go along with that. There was a lot of discussion with Board of Pharmacy regarding licensing, and a lot of questions at the local level of how this should be implemented and what authorities that local jurisdictions had. And ultimately, we received some questions and some feedback from the EMS community really early on, wondering what, if any, impacts that some of these changes had had on demands to the emergency medical services system as a whole. And so we had been working with some EMS agencies, and ultimately Department of Public Safety and Director Hansen had reached out with a couple of questions related to what we were seeing from some of our data, trying to qualify some of the anecdotes that were being reported by law enforcement, EMS, and the fire service across Minnesota. So this wouldn't be any type of presentation by a state agency or bureaucracy if there wasn't at least some government disclaimer. So on issues such as this, it's always important to understand that neither I nor the EMS Regulatory Board take any position on any laws, regulations, or policies on the underlying issues that are being discussed today. But ultimately, we want to share this information solely for the purposes of education and kind of for everyone's general situational awareness. When taking a look at really any type of data set, and certainly with EMS data, developing a case definition for what you are specifically looking for can oftentimes be difficult. So the question that we were trying to answer was, were the legal changes that took place in July of 2022 playing any type of impact on the state's emergency medical services system in terms of volume, patient severity? Were we seeing any adverse operational or clinical effects? So that was the question that we sought to answer. So ultimately, we decided that, even though we collect over, a couple of hundred data points on every single patient care report that's submitted to us, 715,000 each year, there isn't just a box that can be checked to say, this was cannabis related or this was THC related. It doesn't always get into that level of specificity. So fortunately, though, one of the sections of the report that we get is a written narrative, kind of a free text, if you will, where an individual EMT or paramedic, they summarize the call, they state, this is where we went, this is what we did, this is what we saw. So we were able to search those free text narratives, and we searched them for a couple of different fields. We looked for THC, we looked for edible, we looked for a couple of different spellings of gummy for the simple fact that, people can spell things different ways or spell things incorrectly. And at the time that this analysis was done, one of the quote unquote most popular trade names was the Delta 8. So that served as the kind of criteria that we were looking for when we were trying to look at these year-over-year trends or month-over-month trends that we're going to kind of get into here over the course of the next couple of slides. The one thing that I really want to emphasize, though, is that we know that all of these figures represent an undercount, right? So you can make a case definition as broad and encompassing or as specific as you want. And it really depends on what your goal is. So our goal was to look at one very specific segment of the system. So we have a very specific case definition. And as a result, our numbers are going to be smaller. But the key is that by using a consistent definition, we can evaluate multiple years of data, we can evaluate trends over time, and we can have a reasonable idea from a situational awareness perspective of what's going on across the state. So what we have here on the screen is ultimately just a timeline of case counts. And this is looking from January of 2021 all the way through February of 2023, of where we kind of had to cut off the data in order to get this presentation prepared to share with all of you on today's Hotdish. So whenever you're looking at a trend, you can kind of see from January of 2021 a relatively stable process, but we see some increases, a lot of kind of sawtooth pattern, up, down, up, down, up, down, but relatively small numbers ranging from 46 to about 86 that we saw in August of 2021. Now, whenever you see a huge spike or a major change in a condition, that's you want to dig down and try to identify, well, what happened there? What caused us to jump from 94 cases in this case count to 173 in the next month? And ultimately, that was July of 2022, which corresponds to the legislative changes that were made into law through the legislative process. So from June of 2022, where we had 94 EMS patient encounters in our case definition, and then in July of 2022, that figure increased to 173. And overall, that relates to an 84% month-over-month increase. So, there are a lot of different things that can, play an impact. But I think based on what we know, that legislative policy change was, a key driver in taking a look at what caused this trend to alter from its previous trajectory. The other thing that it's important to kind of qualify is that there is a good possibility as well that documentation quality may have increased in July, for the simple fact that it was something that was on everybody's mind, right? And certainly healthcare workers, EMTs, paramedics, no different. They see a lot of things on the news. They see a lot of things, they receive additional continuing education of, hey, these are trends of what we're seeing on the street. So part of it could also be related to they're more trained, they're more focused, they know kind of the kind of things to look for. So there is a lot of different reasons, but that did seem like a fairly stark increase to us, and was certainly worth special note and kind of pointing out to everybody. So then what we wanted to try to do is, that line graph was good to kind of show over time from 2021 to where we're at in 2023. But we also wanted to kind of just make it a little bit easier to look at from a month-by-month perspective. So what we see here is just kind of a clustered bar graph on the by month and a different color for each year. So blue, we're looking at 2021. The green bar, we're looking at 2022. And then the orange bars are our most recent data, and represent 2023. So a couple of special notes here, if you will, is that when we took a look at July 21 to July of 2022, that was a 136% year-over-year increase in going from 73 cases that met our case definition to 173 cases that met our case definition. For February, February being one of the months where we actually had data for 21, 22, and 23, we were able to see that from that February 2021 baseline to February of 2023, we saw a 441% increases in cases. Now, it should be highlighted that the 2021 baseline was only at 36 cases and only increased to 195. But certainly, once again, there definitely is an increase using this case definition, and is something that should be monitored over time, and to try to see what other types of effects it may be having on public health or the EMS system from an operational perspective. The other thing that I do want to highlight here, though, in the month of March, please note that March, that data was incomplete. It was only through March 13th. And I suspect that if I were to run this data again today, that it would follow a similar trend, and it would be above our 2021 baseline, and also probably likely above our 2022 baseline, and probably on target for probably between 150 to 160 cases, if I had to give a projection. So one of the other things that we can do with our emergency medical services data is that we can kind of chart things out from a statewide perspective and look at different trends. This is something that we have done frequently with naloxone administration and opioid usage to try to identify trends in terms of days of week, hours of day, to try to identify where these types of calls are occurring, both to be prepared and also to serve as some type of intelligence, kind of trying to use some predictive analytics, if you will, of where these encounters are happening and where there's the potential for trouble. Ultimately, from a public perspective, we're required to suppress any data in which individuals could potentially be identified. So it's the standing policy of the EMSRB, in addition to different rules under the HIPAA, Federal Data Protection Act for healthcare information. We suppress values that are less than 20 from a public perspective. But when we were able to look at from a 2021 to 2023 perspective, we were able to at least identify that it is our Friday evening and our Saturday evening hours, really from the 5 p.m. hour through the 11 p.m. hour, that had the highest frequency of cases that fell within this time frame statewide. Now, one of the other aspects, and the reason why we're all here today, is of everybody's dedication and focus to making Minnesota's roadways safer, as we all work towards that mission of moving towards zero deaths. One of the things, though, that we are able to look at as well is we were able to look at this case definition, and we were able to see what type of dispatch complaint were these instances most associated with. And to be honest, there weren't too many surprises for me. Overdose, poisoning, ingestion, which is a dispatch category, made up the most at 23% of our cases meeting the definition, followed by sick person, followed by unconscious fainting and near fainting, chest pain, and then breathing problems. Interestingly enough, less than 1% of the cases that met our case definition were included that had an associated dispatch for a traffic or transportation incident or motor vehicle collision. So in terms of what we're seeing from these case definitions, there is at this point not a large, I guess, association with motor vehicle collisions. However, that does not mean that these instances, though, aren't occurring on Minnesota roadways. There are a lot of different ways for an EMS response to be initiated, right? It could be an individual who doesn't like the way they feel. They feel funny and they're at home, and perhaps they haven't used a product like this before, and they get scared and they activate EMS. That's something that we're hearing anecdotally from providers on the street. And then certainly there are other instances where perhaps law enforcement has initiated a traffic stop, having evidence that that operator is potentially impaired, and then EMS then gets called for an evaluation. So these instances can still be occurring on the roadway, but at this point there doesn't appear to be a huge impact on the number of motor vehicle collisions from the data that we presently see. And this is something that we're going to be continuing to look at. And certainly we like to compare some of the trends that we're seeing to other states that have kind of gone down similar evolutions, if you will. There's a lot of published data that comes out of the state of Colorado reflective to what the effects of their EMS system when they underwent legalization of cannabis several years ago. And then kind of close out the presentation this morning with just some general demographics on the basis of our case definition. The top slide, the top visual that we have on the slide here is an indicator of by age. So we took a look at the different age ranges and tried to identify how many cases fell within each range. And it was the 30 to 39-year-old age group that came in with the highest number of cases. And that was followed up by the 60-plus-year-old age group, which came in second, and I believe right around 233 cases. Now, the 0 to 17 is something that's also something important to monitor, and certainly we'll be looking to potentially do some further breakdowns on this in the future. But that could be encompassing of a couple of different factors. Certainly, it could be utilization of these products by individuals under the age of 18. But it also starts to run into situations where if these products are not packaged appropriately or are not safely and securely stored, we do run into instances where toddler aged and other children can get into those and bypass those child safety features on bottles and things of that nature. And then that turns into a poison control situation, and ultimately EMS can be summoned from those. So that's just a quick breakdown on the age that we're seeing with this case definition. From a sex and gender perspective, really no statistically significant differences between males and females that fall into the case definition. And then finally, in taking a look at by race and ethnicity, we see that just shy of 63% of individuals who fall into the case definition are white, then followed by about 20% where that data simply wasn't reported on the EMS provider's chart. So we have no real way to dig into those cases. And then about 10.3% as being Black or African American, and then the smaller percentages rounding out the other race and ethnicity categories that are tracked by the National EMS Information System. So ultimately, that's a summary kind of from a situational perspective of what we're seeing on the streets right now. And like I said, I'll just emphasize one last time. fairly restrictive case definition specific to the question that we were trying to answer, and just realize that that is an undercount. But by keeping it consistent over time, we can see how the situation is evolving. So that's going to conclude my presentation this morning. My contact information is on the screen. Should anyone have additional questions after today or on any other EMS issue, please feel free to reach out. And Director Hanson, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Hey, Dylan, thank you very much. I remember some of our early discussions here and some of the things that we identified right off the bat. And I think your presentation really does a nice job outlining, some of the things that are occurring out there. And I look forward to further research. Obviously, we're looking at a fairly narrow scope and a narrow band of time when it comes to doing a true research analysis. But I think that this is something that we're all needing to pay attention to as we move forward. So thank you. And with that, everybody, we will move into the second part of our presentation this morning. And our next speakers today are Sergeant Tyler Millis with the Minnesota State Patrol and Mr. David Bernstein. A little brief background for both. Sergeant Millis graduated in 2015 from Minnesota State University Mankato with a bachelor's degree in law enforcement and an associate's degree in psychology. In 2022, he obtained his master's degree in business management and leadership from Western Governors University. Sergeant Millis attended the Minnesota State Patrol Training Academy in 2016, and after graduation, he was stationed first in Fairmont for just over a year, and then transferred to the West Metro District, where he was assigned to the Dog Watch or overnight shift. And he spent a year there before transitioning to the Elk River Station. In 2020, Sergeant Millis took the promotion to sergeant and became the coordinator for the statewide DRE program. Mr. David Bernstein currently serves as the Deputy City Attorney of the Criminal Division of the Minneapolis City Attorney's Office. As a trial and appellate attorney, he specializes in alcohol and drug-based DWIs and serious traffic cases, and he previously attended the full 2-week DRE school, one of the few prosecutors in the state that has done that, but also many in his office have done that. He regularly presents trainings to attorneys, to law enforcement, and the public across the state. In addition, David has been the chair of the Minnesota DWI Task Force since 2014. And in that capacity, David has drafted DWI legislation and has testified before the legislature numerous times on DWI-related bills. And I look forward to this discussion, as I know when we get these two in the same room together, the discussion is always lively, it's always informative, and it's always entertaining. So, David and Sergeant Millis, I am going to turn the screen over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. And again, welcome. Good morning. My name is David Bernstein. I'm with the Minneapolis City Attorney's Office and the Minnesota DWI Task Force. And I am pleased to be presenting with Sergeant Millis.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Sergeant, we heard about your bio, but for those who are unfamiliar, can you just briefly describe the DRE program?
The DRE program specializes in drug impaired driving. So a normal officer can apply to go to the school. We are accepting attorneys as well. We're more than happy to have them join the school as well. They go through 9 days of classroom, and then we actually have been flying out to Philadelphia for certifications. They have to do 12 certification evaluations under the discretion of an instructor, and then they take a comprehensive final knowledge exam, at which point then they are a DRE. So they're very highly trained and specialize in drug impaired driving.
And again, you heard my background as well. I'm going to give a plug to my office, the Minneapolis City Attorney's Office. We prosecute the most DWIs in the state of Minnesota, both alcohol and drug-based. We have a dedicated DRE team, and all of our attorneys on the DRE team have attended the full 2-week DRE school. So we take those cases very seriously. You heard Director Hanson talk about the DWI task force. We are heavily involved with the legislature, including with the cannabis legalization bill and highway safety considerations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But if anyone's interested in the DWI task force and in getting involved, please contact me and we're happy to have you. We're a big supporter with the TZD program and often collaborate with them. So the basic topics that Sergeant Millis and I are going to talk about this morning. First of all, Sergeant Millis is going to teach you about the DOE curriculum as it teaches impairment effects of cannabis or THC. We'll talk about the public perception of cannabis and driving. I'll go over existing cannabis DWI laws and pending legislation. One of the things to keep in mind, and I'll talk about this later, you're going to hear lots of terms: marijuana, cannabis, THC. Even the legislature is trying to decide which term to use. We're kind of using that term interchangeably to the extent that there's a distinction. We'll talk about it, but the DOE curriculum focuses on cannabis. And so that's the term we're going to use most prevalently. So Sergeant Millis, teach us about cannabis.
So cannabis is the entire plant. It's called Cannabis sativa. That is the plant name, which a lot of people call marijuana. So within cannabis, there's two different species. There's hemp and then there's marijuana. The hemp is what we in Minnesota call non-intoxicating cannabinoids. So it's going to contain 0.3% THC or less. And then on the other hand, marijuana would be anything that contains more THC than 0.3%. And we'll talk about the levels in a minute here. So there's three different strains now. We have the Cannabis sativa, the entire plant, and then there's different strains of that plant. The first one that you'll see on the far left is sativa, so it gets a little bit confusing. The second one's indica, and the third one is hybrid. So when you're looking at sativa, that's going to be a taller, thin plant. Same with the leaf. If you look at the leaves in these pictures, the sativa is going to be long and skinny. Indica is going to be short and stocky. Same with the leaf. And then hybrid is the most common, which is anything in between. In order to get hybrid, basically a farmer cross-pollinates them and creates the plant that they want. Majority of the time this happens in greenhouses and on farms.
So when I think of THC, I think of weed and Cheetos like everybody, right? But what exactly is THC? It's a chemical, isn't it?
Yes. So THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol. So when you are dealing with individuals on the street and they talk about their weed, 90, I shouldn't say a percentage, but the majority of them are looking for the THC, the tetrahydrocannabinol. What that is it's the chemical in the plant that contains psychoactive ingredients and characteristics. So this is the portion of the plant that gets people the mind high and feeling buzzed.
One of the things that amazed me as I learned more about this is the different kinds of THC. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so now we've talked about cannabis sativa, the plant as a whole. We've talked about the different strains, and then we've talked about THC. And now within THC, there's different kinds. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you're going to see a list of them. One thing you should know is almost all of it starts with THCA. It's basically the raw form from the plant. In order to get delta 9, you'll see that midway down the screen there, which is the most common. That's what you'll be dealing with. A lot of our tox results, we'll talk about those in a minute, come back with delta 9. What they do is THCA comes from the plant. As soon as they add heat to that, it turns into delta 9. And then from delta 9, they can take that and change it into delta 8, delta 10. And then at the bottom, CBD, CBN, that's going to be your non-psychoactive. It's not going to impair people.
So you heard Dylan talk about delta 8. That's becoming a lot more common. Delta 10 is starting to become more common as well, all of these different derivatives. Right now, those are not regulated by the legislature. There's been discussion about whether or not they should regulate, but those are still active discussions. And so the current state of the law with respect to delta 8 and delta 10 is kind of questionable compared to delta 9. But when we talk about impairment, we're going to be talking about something different, which we'll get to in a little bit.
And real quick on that note, delta 8 is a thing. It is out there. It can impair people. They have to use more of it than they would delta 9. And delta 10 is kind of there, but it's not as pure as they're wanting it or saying it is. So if you end up finding that, it's a little more uncommon, and it'd be interesting to get tested.
Yeah, so we're going to talk next about kind of the history of THC. And one of the really important points is that marijuana or cannabis or THC has really changed over the years. Sergeant Willis, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest issues that when I'm having conversations with people, this is one of the things I really hit on. A lot of people in I should say higher power, they have this conception or this thought that the average THC levels in cannabis is still in that where we're seeing that mid 1990s, which averages 2 to 4%. If an individual had that, they would have to take quite a bit of it in order to get high. Now, if you fast forward, look at 2014, those levels, that plant is being chemically altered so that the THC level increases, and some strains are upwards of, I actually just looked yesterday, and currently from 2014 to now, that level has gone up to 42, 43%, as high as they are. And then again, CBD, Minnesota non-intoxicating cannabinoids, is 0.3% THC or less. And then your edibles, here in Minnesota, we have a 5 milligram limit per dose. However, in other states, people can make those as high as they want to. It's really up to them on how much they put in there. And then wax and dab is another huge issue, especially in our youth. Very common in high school, college age individuals. That stuff can get upwards of 99% THC. And I'll show you a picture in a minute here. And then Leafline Labs, that is it got bought out now, but that is one of our medical companies. And that is just saying that, again, it's kind of similar to edibles. They can make it however strong they want.
Quick point about CBD. That is non-psychoactive, but there was a report released several weeks ago talking about the combination of THC and CBD and how that does cause impairment. And we'll talk later about polydrug use and the additive effect, but just know that CBD alone is one thing. When you combine it with other substances, that's another. Now, when I learned about wax and dabs, those numbers were staggering to me, and I think the pictures will illustrate what they are. Sergeant Millis, tell us more about this.
So what individuals do, one of the most common methods is they will take their leaf cannabis, they'll grind it up, and then they stick it in basically a giant tube. And the easiest way is they take a coffee filter, they strap that to the bottom, and then they take butane and push butane through it. And then the liquid that comes out of it is this gold color. What they do with that liquid then is put it on either a hot plate or over the top of boiling water to get all of the liquid out of there, and then it turns into the sticky substance like you see on your screen. Now, another huge point that I always make, and I want to make again today, is the picture on the right there. That amount of wax can get probably 50 to 75 people high. So take that seriously, especially those on the road. When you're seeing that, take it seriously.
Yeah, real quick point on butane hash oil or BHO. You'll see videos of houses exploding with people trying to extract the THC at home and making a mistake. There was a Fox 9 news story back in August about a house, I think in Crystal, and their story is nationwide. So this is a really, really dangerous process that hopefully if people are trying to do this, they're doing so safely, but it's something to keep an eye on from a public safety standpoint. So let's talk about what the DRE curriculum teaches about signs of ingestion or impairment related to THC.
Yeah, so some signs of ingestion and impairment. Number one is the odor. Now, this is if they're smoking bud or loose leaf marijuana. If they're using edibles, even to some extent, if they're using that butane hash oil, sometimes that's more of a chemical smell, but the edibles, you're not going to have an odor with those. A lot of times the vapes, you're not going to have an odor. So again, sticking to bud and loose leaf, you'll have that odor. Red bloodshot eyes. This kind of depends on their tolerance. A lot of new users, and for a while they'll have the red bloodshot eyes. As they get more tolerant to it, that seems to go away a little bit more, and becomes kind of different from person to person. Lack of convergence, that middle picture you see on your screen, that's the inability for someone to cross their eyes. Now, yes, there is a population of people that simply can't cross their eyes, but this is just one piece of the puzzle that we look at. Lack of convergence also happens in alcohol, CNS depressants, inhalants, dissociative anesthetics, and then lastly, cannabis is why we're talking about it today. Debris in the mouth, that's also going to depend on how they're using it. If they're using smoking it, again, loose leaf, you'll have that green coating that you're seeing on your screen there. Understanding edibles, you're not going to have a green coating. It's going to depend on what they eat, which could be chocolate or gummy bears, Body tremors and eyelid tremors, that's the involuntary, essentially it looks like shivering. It's the involuntary tremoring of their body. One of the big things we look for is the tremors in the eye. When you have someone close their eyes and tip their heads back, even just close their eyes, their eyelids will flutter. Again, it's involuntary and they have no idea they're doing it.
So these are signs and symptoms you look for in a person as an officer is investigating. But there are other general ways that cannabis can impact a person's ability to operate a motor vehicle based on the effects of cannabis. Sergeant Millis, tell us about those.
So again, different. We'll talk. I'm going to now back to the strain. So indica, it puts you in the couch. It's going to make people a little more calm, maybe quote unquote lazy. And then sativa is an upper, and it stimulates the body and makes people more excited. So when we talk about relaxation, that can be dependent on the strain they are taking, but it is known wide across that cannabis can make you relaxed. Obviously, if they're driving, that could be an issue of them falling asleep or something of that nature. Euphoria, relaxed inhibitions, disorientation, lack of concentration, altered time of distance and perception. We look at those last couple. Let's relate that to driving. If someone doesn't know time and distance, they're going to have a problem stopping in time. Lack of concentration, they're not going to see that vehicle in front of them hitting the brakes, right? Disoriented, they have no idea kind of their surrounding and what's going on. Impaired memory, drowsiness, sedation, mood changes, all things that can be tied. Again, understanding that different strains can act a little bit different and cause different effects on the body.
Yeah, and to Sergeant Millis's point, I work as a prosecutor and I do trainings for law enforcement and prosecutors. It's really important to tie the impairment effects of cannabis to driving. We have to prove under the influence or impairment. And so the bloodshot, watery eyes, this, if they have slurred speech, if they have an odor, their performance on field sobriety tests or the DRE evaluation, how does that influence driving? And these are some of the things that prosecutors can argue to the jury in closing statements, that it causes a lack of concentration, altered time and distance perception. These are also things that can be discussed on direct examination in front of the jury to teach them about how the signs and symptoms correlate to driving behavior. And that kind of leads into our next slide. There's so many ways that cannabis can influence a person's general behavior, and it's easy to tie that to driving. Things like concentration, reaction time, those are really, really important to operating a motor vehicle safely. And Sergeant, I'm sure some of these are readily apparent to troopers when you see someone roadside.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, be careful when you're doing your research, and we do as best a job as we can when we're looking at it. When you look at studies, there is going to be a study kind of for whatever side you want to see. So there are studies that show that cannabis makes people more lazy as time goes on. It affects their brain, things like that. And a lot of them say that. We're lucky enough to have people like Dylan that are dedicated to finding in-house statistics. So obviously, if because he has those statistics, this stuff is real, and marijuana, cannabis does affect people. So otherwise they wouldn't be calling 911. But all of the things you're seeing on your screen are possible influences from cannabis that can happen to people and do happen to people.
So credit to the BCA, they have expanded their testing capabilities. And when they test for cannabis or THC in blood, this is the list of results that you'll see. Sergeant, can you talk about this list and what each of these items mean?
Yeah, so when we get a tox result back, this is going to be a blood result that comes back. The first thing you see on your screen, that Delta 9, when we're looking at the type of drug, look under on that list there, Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That's the main psychoactive ingredient in THC, or sorry, in cannabis. If that comes back, that is a good indicator that they were using very recently, as well as that second line, the 11-hydroxy. For short, you just want to call that hydroxy THC. Hydroxy, and then the one just below that, the third one, carboxy, those are metabolites of Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. So when you put cannabis in your body, it breaks down and it starts breaking down into hydroxy and carboxy THC. That carboxy is a non-psychoactive ingredient or metabolite. So there is some hang up on there. If you have an attorney maybe that it doesn't know enough, let's say, you don't know what you don't know. So if it happens, feel free to reach out to us and we can help explain that. And then going down from there, they just added recently the capability of testing for Delta 8, CBD, CBN, and CBG.
So prosecutors, as you look at this test result, here's what you should be thinking. The Delta 9 THC, as Sergeant Miller said, is indicative of recent use, and the hydroxy metabolite is the active or psychoactive metabolite. The carboxy is inactive, it's non-psychoactive. So you should not factor in the carboxy metabolite, non-psychoactive, when you're deciding whether to make a charging decision. The one way it does become relevant, though, you've heard Sergeant Millis talk about tolerances, and it affects people differently depending on how much they use. That carboxy number can be indicative of how often they use. And the higher the number, typically, the more often they use, and it stays in their system longer. So keep that in mind when you're evaluating impairment. That can factor into the analysis as well.
And one thing real quick to be aware of is that carboxy, that's the metabolite that stays in that person's system for, there was a study just done that showed it up, I think it was 6 weeks. Is that correct, David?
I've seen up to a month, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 6 weeks now.
So that is, I mean, we can differentiate to how recent they've done. There's a lot of individuals out there that say, well, the chemical stays in their body for a month. That's just that carboxy portion of it. The Delta 9 and the hydroxy leave the body quicker than that. So we can differentiate from that.
Exactly. So it is important to follow the science, and the National Safety Council issued a report in a research document in 2017 concluding 2 really important things. The quotes are here. I'm not going to read them, but this PowerPoint will be made available to you. The takeaway from the first quote is that THC has the ability to impair a person's ability to operate a motor vehicle. And so it is properly in the DWI laws. It affects people differently, but it at least has the capacity to cause impairment. So that's important. The second conclusion, though, is concluding that there's no equivalent to 0.08 for marijuana or THC or cannabis. Some states have enacted a 5 nanogram per se limit. And what research has shown is that some people above 5 nanograms may not be impaired, and some people below 5 nanograms will be impaired. Colorado enacted a 5 nanogram per se limit, and they've recently moved to repeal that law. So that means we will not have an equivalent for 0.08 for marijuana. That's what science supports right now. Now, we'll see as further studies are done, maybe there comes a point when science reaches a different conclusion with more data, but right now, we're not going to have a 0.08. So that means prosecutors are going to have to prove under the influence or impairment without a specific number. And that does make the cases difficult, but right now, that's what the science supports. I mentioned polydrug use earlier. That is really, really important. Sergeant Millis, I know this is taught in DRE school. What can you tell us about the additive effect in polydrug use?
So poly drug use in the DRE program is basically anytime somebody takes multiple drugs, 2 or more, and uses them at the same time. So the most common thing that we see, especially with cannabis, is the combination of marijuana and alcohol. It's very common. So the additive effect is when you take 2 substances that have the same effect on a body, you put them together and it's going to increase that exponentially. So when you talk about alcohol, CBD, Xanax, prescription drugs, that's all things that are really commonly used with cannabis, and we have to be aware of that. So some of the issues you see on the screen with the marijuana and alcohol specific can cause a lot of issues, and some of the other effects that take place as well. Sometimes some of them are opposite, and then the body's just constantly in a fight mode over which drug at the time is going to be present in that body. So just know that when you start mixing things, anything's on the table. We don't necessarily know exactly what we're going to see, and it could be all over the place.
And this is a message that I brought to the legislature, that if cannabis is going to be legalized, the concern is not just about cannabis itself. The concern is about mixing cannabis with other substances. And there's so many people in the public that take prescription drugs that may not be considering how those interact with cannabis. And that's why public education is going to be so incredibly important for people to understand this. At the same time, there's concerns about contaminants as well. And there's a nationwide concern, and anecdotally, we've seen this at the Minneapolis City Attorney's Office, cases in which people have smoked marijuana and then they pass out not knowing what happened, and the blood test results come back positive for fentanyl. And so we are seeing an increase in marijuana being laced with fentanyl in Minnesota and nationwide. There's also a concern about packaging and whether or not that packaging is accurate. You may have heard about a lawsuit that was brought by the Minnesota Board of Pharmacy. There was a company that was advertising and selling edibles that were found to be 50 times more potent than what is allowed under the law. Now, the edibles law isn't exactly clear on how that's enforced, and that's something the legislature is considering in the cannabis legalization bill. But it is really, really important for people to understand what is in the product that they're purchasing, even if it's legal. And obviously, it's very, very important that they be advertised correctly. And so that is something that the Board of Pharmacy is watching very, very carefully. The Minnesota Department of Health as well. And it remains to be seen kind of what regulatory schemes are in place, but I anticipate there to be more regulation and enforcement of that. So then the issue becomes public opinion. There's a public perception about driving under the influence of alcohol. 1 in 7 people have an alcohol-related loss of license on their license in the state of Minnesota. And there are legislators who say, well, people make mistakes sometimes. When it comes to marijuana, it's even heightened because people think that driving under the influence of marijuana is safer than driving under the influence of alcohol. There are AAA reports that have been done. There have been studies out of Canada where cannabis has been legalized longer, Colorado. People believe that they're okay to drive after consuming marijuana. And in some cases, maybe that's true, but there's also the real reality that it can cause impairment and it can put public safety at risk. And so we talk a lot in the public safety community about driving safely and making responsible choices. And it's going to be all the more important for public safety to reach the crowd related to marijuana as well, to make safe decisions and to educate people on the dangers of driving under the influence of marijuana, that it can cause impairment and it's not worth the risk. I think the challenge of that is, we know that cannabis is so pervasive in our society, and it's becoming more and more so as more states legalize. And so you see, public figures using marijuana, and you see protests, and you see people going to Colorado. You see TikTok videos, all sorts of things that we're going to have to overcome as a public safety community to emphasize the public safety concerns. So just a few examples. There was a study by JAMA in 2021. Participants were willing to drive an hour and 30 minutes after use, but there was worse driving performance evident several hours after use, and that is related to cannabis. The AAA study that I mentioned, the majority of people, sorry for the typo, feel that it's safer to drive after consuming marijuana than alcohol. And so these are some of the public perceptions we'll have to overcome. And really the important thing we'll have to do is get the education and awareness out there. Colorado has come out with statistics, and that includes fatalities and crashes with drivers having 5 or more nanograms of THC in their system. Again, Colorado has that per se limit. You see the numbers here after legalization. The one caveat I want to mention, this shows the amount of THC in their system. It doesn't necessarily reach the conclusion that all of these individuals were impaired. There could have been a different reason for the crash. Maybe speed was involved, maybe distracted driving was involved, maybe there were other substances and there was polydrug. So, look at these statistics carefully and scrutinize them, but it does give just a broad picture of how many people were found with 5 or more nanograms of THC in their system in fatal crashes. Washington State also has statistics. They were also one of the earlier states to legalize marijuana. You see prior to 2012, prior to legalization, what the numbers were, and after 2012, what the numbers have been. Now, again, same caveat, this shows the percentage of drivers in fatal crashes were positive for marijuana. So there was some THC in their system. It doesn't necessarily mean they were impaired. It doesn't necessarily mean that that was the cause of the crash, but it does show that they had cannabis in their system. And so that's worth following up on and hopefully gaining more statistics as more data becomes available. There was a study done by the Cato Institute, and this was reported on in the Star Tribune. The Star Tribune reported that the Cato Institute believes that that fatal crashes will actually go down with cannabis legalization. It's important to actually look at that Cato Institute report. It is a large report of which only 2 paragraphs are dedicated to road safety. They talk about many, many other things, taxation, all sorts of things. But take a look at what they actually say, and that's why I put the quote in here. What the Cato Institute is claiming, and I didn't see any substantiation for this, is they believe that the number of alcohol-related fatalities will decrease and the number of marijuana-related fatalities will increase, and so it's a net zero effect. That's what they're saying. So this is being misreported on in the media. What I would say to this is in Minnesota, we want to do better. And this is a TZD Hotdish. TZD stands for towards zero deaths. It doesn't stand for towards zero net. It stands for towards zero deaths, zero period. So even if this is true, I don't accept this. And I think we in Minnesota don't accept this either. We want 0 deaths on our roadways. I don't know that there's a reason to believe that alcohol-related fatalities will go down. But even if it does, we don't want marijuana-related fatalities to go up either. So we're going to continue our really important mission of towards 0 deaths, 0 period. So let's talk about DWI laws in the state of Minnesota, and I'm going to talk about the current state of the law, and then we'll talk about the proposed legislation this year. So this is our current law for controlled substances. It is a crime for any person to drive, operate, or be in physical control of a motor vehicle while under the influence of a controlled substance. A controlled substance includes marijuana and THC. Right now, marijuana is a Schedule I controlled substance. It does not qualify for the per se law. It's specifically excluded from the per se law. So when we have an under the influence of marijuana charge, it's charged under this statute. As prosecutors, we look at criminal jury instructions. Judges have created instructions to ensure that people are juries across the state of Minnesota are instructed the same. And this is what the jury instruction teaches about under the influence. And I have a training I do every year at the DRE school, and I talk a lot about this. Take a look at that second sentence. When a person is so affected by controlled substance that the person does not possess that clearness of intellect and control of themselves as they otherwise would have, that person is under the influence of a controlled substance. That is as close as we get to a definition of impairment in the state of Minnesota. And so as a prosecutor, that is my legal standard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And when I present the evidence and when I work with my officer, particularly DREs, I train officers on how to correlate their observations to this legal definition. And then in my closing statement, I make sure to make this clear to the jury how the investigation applies to this legal definition. And this is, you'll hear attorneys talk about this a lot, a totality of the circumstances. It's not any one thing. We look at everything. So the officer's training and experience, the driving conduct, if there is driving conduct that shows impairment, the officer's observations, any admissions made, performance on field sobriety tests. If there's a DRE examination, that's huge. And then what do the test results show? And so we put all of those things together to argue to the jury that there is impairment beyond a reasonable doubt. Really, really important. Medical cannabis is not a defense to DWIs. So we currently have the medical cannabis program. First of all, medical cannabis in Minnesota is not a prescription. And that is the affirmative defense is a prescription drug defense. Cannabis is still federally regulated and illegal. And so doctors do not prescribe it. Individuals become participants in the medical cannabis program, but it's not a prescription. So that's the first reason why it doesn't apply. But secondly, the prescription drug defense only applies to the per se Schedule 1 or 2 controlled substance law. And as I mentioned, marijuana is specifically excluded from that in the context of DWIs. So we have to prove impairment. And as with any drug, impairment does not affect that prescription drug defense. The prescription drug defense only applies to presence. It does not apply to impairment. And that's why you see here at the bottom, impairment is impairment. If the person is impaired, the prescription drug defense does not apply. It does not matter. They still can be found guilty of that impairment charge. So Sergeant Millis has been, he's the chair of the DWI Task Force's DWI Marijuana Subcommittee. And the DWI Task Force has put together some highway safety proposals to the legislature. We're not taking position on the cannabis legalization bill. It's much broader and beyond the purview of the DWI Task Force. But what we are advising the legislature is if this cannabis legalization bill passes, here are some necessary highway safety considerations that should be included as well. We've gotten this advice from a lot of other states that have said to get ahead of this. It's a lot harder to play catch up. And so as they're discussing legalization, better to get this in now. And so I've been at the legislature testifying on behalf of the DWI Task Force regarding highway safety considerations. I've had a lot of meeting with legislators and it's been an interesting process. So the first thing that I've told the legislature on behalf of the DWI Task Force is we need to come up with a consistent term, whether it be cannabis, whether it be marijuana, whether it be THC. We need to know that we're talking about the same thing. And the legislature is really struggling with this. They want to move away from the term marijuana. However, marijuana is in the federal scheduled controlled substances laws. And so they want to keep our laws consistent with the federal controlled substance laws. With that said, the cannabis legalization bill proposes moving marijuana from Schedule 1 controlled substance to a Schedule 3 controlled substance, yet it still uses the term marijuana. In many other portions of the bill, the term cannabis or cannabinoid or cannabinol are used. And so one thing I've advised the legislature is the more terms you use in different places, the more ambiguity and confusion there probably is. And so it's important to use one term whenever possible. And I think the authors have told me they're trying to get there, but it's been difficult so far. THC, I'm keeping in the conversation as well in the context of DWIs, because when we get blood test results or urine, you see THC. It doesn't identify cannabis or marijuana, it identifies THC. And so I've advised the legislature that in the context of DWI laws, THC needs to be included in those laws. Couple of things that have been added into the bill based upon the DWI task force's proposals. First of all, it prohibits use while driving. So you cannot use or consume marijuana that is not just related to smoking, but edibles or THC infused beverages. Can't use it while driving. We're trying to align that with alcohol laws. Similarly, open packages. We have the open bottle law for alcohol. And similarly, we proposed an open package law for marijuana that you either need to have the package closed, or if it's open, it needs to be in the trunk. That's consistent with alcohol as well. Both of these have been added to both the House and the Senate bills. And so if cannabis legalization were to pass, these will pass as well. There's also an oral fluid roadside testing pilot project included. There are 22 or 23 states that currently have this technology. Minnesota's tried for a few years to bring it here. This is something that I've worked on with Sergeant Millis, Director Hansen, my colleague Amy Tripp Steiner, and others. This is a PBT for drugs. Rather than use a breath test, you obtain a saliva test roadside, and it detects for the presence of 6 different categories of drugs, or a different number depending on which system you use. And that's to help establish probable cause for arrest and for a search warrant to obtain an evidentiary blood or urine sample. So it's another tool in the toolbox that would be helpful to law enforcement. We're trying to create a pilot project to get an RFP, test the different systems to decide which one is most accurate, and hopefully roll it out after that. This is included in both bills. And so if the cannabis legalization bill passes, this will pass as well. The DWI task force has proposed additional highway safety considerations that the House and Senate have not adopted so far. First of all, there is a higher standard for bus drivers and commercial vehicle drivers for alcohol, and we proposed a similar law for cannabis. Also, the underage drinking and driving law, so the no drop limit for under 21, we proposed the same for cannabis. Those have not been adopted. From what I've heard, the big concern is that inactive metabolite. And so we've tried telling the legislature that we're limiting it to the psychoactive components, but so far they're either not understanding that, agreeing with that, or have concerns about it. So those have not been adopted in the cannabis legalization bill. Funding. Law enforcement will need more funding for training, for education. The BCA is going to need more funding for testing capabilities. The DRE program, we're going to need more DREs. And so Sergeant Millis is working hard at obtaining that funding. So we have talked to the legislature about that. One really, really important consideration. Right now, at least last time I checked the bill, it only provides for funding for the state patrol. It does not provide for funding for municipal agencies. And the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association, the Minnesota Sheriff's Association have commented on that. And so I hope that that changes, because the funding will not just be needed for state patrol, those municipal agencies are going to need funding as well. So if you're in a municipal police department, track that and try to get your police department involved in those efforts to get funding for your agency and other municipal agencies.
David, just a quick heads up, got about 5 minutes before we're going to lose our connectivity.
I appreciate that. So second to last slide here, the most important thing, educate the public. We need to get that public education out there. And I know Director Hansen, on behalf of the Office of Traffic Safety, is going to work on some public awareness and education campaigns. The DWI task force is going to work with OTS as well. And I'm sure other agencies will be involved, but this will be incredibly important. And there is our contact information if you have questions. I know Sergeant Millis and I are both willing to help out anytime. So feel free to contact us if you have questions as they arise. And if you're interested in the DWI task force, please contact me as well. And I'll turn it back over to you, Director Hanson.
Very good. Hey, Sergeant Millis and David, thank you very much. Really interesting, really informative presentation there. While I get the questions spooled up here, we'll take a few minutes to try and get through a few of those. If we don't get to your question, please reach out to one of our speakers directly and they will get back to you. For those of you who are viewing, as you can see, we've got a QR code up there. Please click on that and complete the survey. We really would like you to do that. We use your survey results because that tells us what our future hot dishes should look like. And it gives us feedback on the one that you just viewed there. So please take a minute, take a snap of that and then respond to the survey. We would really appreciate it. As a reminder for your calendars, our next traffic safety hot dish topic to be determined based on your feedback today will be July 19th, 2023, and we will start that one at 10 o'clock Central. So with that, let me open up the question and answers here, and I'm going to kind of go through these randomly as we have a few of them here. No, I got the wrong one. There we are. Okay, here's one question. In my prior encounters with THC impaired drivers, they're clearly impaired on the roadside. However, the effects tend to wear off rather quickly, and the impairment is not as prevalent by the time a DRE gets there. Generally, I see this with somebody who's been smoking bud. Many times the DRE indicates that they do not have a lot of indicators, but state that this is common for it to wear off quickly. Have there been any issues with prosecution of these types of cases? David, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Yeah, so it's hard because I just had a marijuana DWI trial last month, and I thought there was pretty strong evidence with the 3-car crash. There was a full DRE exam. Delta 9 THC was found. And so I thought, this is a great case. And, I had some issues with witness testimony. And so I received a not guilty verdict on the DWI charge. And I understand why. But the answer is yes, there are absolutely issues with prosecution in these cases, in part because of that public perception. And, I train law enforcement and prosecutors on jury bias and coming in with those perspectives of, well, marijuana isn't that dangerous. Why are we talking about it? And I tried to address that in my own case in jury selection and focusing on the facts of my case. And yet still the feedback I got from the jury through the judge was they were wondering why I took this case to trial, if I'm trying to make law or what I was doing with it. So I think there's going to be a big hurdle with jury bias and perceptions, and we're going to have a really difficult time overcoming that. The best we can do is put our best foot forward with the facts and the law, and we argue it as best we can, but it's going to be difficult.
Very good. Thank you, David. Here's one, and I'll take a quick swing at this. If the bill passes, and considering how complex THC impairment can be, should part of our education campaign including information on how people can know if they're too impaired to drive? And I would just fall back on the basic messaging that we've been putting out for a number of years, in that if you feel different, you drive different. And if you have to ask yourself, am I too impaired? You are too impaired. So because of, and Sergeant Millis, I'll let you weigh in on this, because of how drugs and specifically marijuana interact with each human being completely differently, whereas alcohol affects all of us kind of the same way, that there is no real solid way to make that determination. Sergeant, do I have that kind of that layman's understanding of toxicology right?
Yeah, this will answer a few of those questions, but the point of us going through the plan is it is very complex. So even when we talk about different strains, it affects people so differently. They could be using the exact same product and there'll be completely different behaviors on it. And with that, the different metabolites of it, the numbers indicate kind of how much they've used in a way. We tend not to point towards those a lot because, for instance, in Colorado, their studies, they had that 5 nanogram limit, for driving, and a lot of their fatal crashes and crashes in general were happening well under that 5 nanograms. And because it affects people so differently, that's why we want to stay away from that per se limit. So it's a really complex, like I said, and it just affects people so differently that it's hard to pinpoint exact specific things that we need to look for and how we need to have this limit or that limit. We just want to stay away from that. And one of the government or the federal government's sayings is, if it makes you feel different, it makes you drive different. And that's 100% true. And that's what we want to focus on with cannabis as well.
All right. Hey, everybody, we realize we're just a little bit past time, and I want to thank everybody for attending today's Traffic Safety Hot Dish. I'd like to give a huge shout out to our 3 speakers. Gentlemen, thank you for a really informative and really interesting presentation today. Again, for those whose questions we didn't get to, please reach out to one of the panelists individually, and we will call that a day, and I look forward to seeing everybody at the next Traffic Safety Hot Dish. So please make sure you fill out that survey so we can make sure we're presenting the information that you want to see in real time. And everybody have a great day and great rest of the week. Thank you for being here today.